Chapter 542 Seeking help. Young Wanyu didn't know how to respond to her words. At the same time, she was highly annoyed. She had been so worried that she had overlooked the fact that the first prince had left the palace to run an errand. She had damaged her reputation in the eyes of the consort, and this would be something to mock her for in the future. But remembering their purpose, she could only ask, when will His Highness return? It's hard to say. We usually only have dinner together at night. The rest of the time depends on His Highness' mood. Of course, with such a major thing happening to the Yang family, he should be back soon if His Highness doesn't have anything important. It's the same as not saying anything. Yang Wanning muttered to herself. She jolted after realizing the same thing. If the first prince had the intention to help, he would have gone to their place long ago. It was apparent that the first prince did not want to see them. Thinking of this, her heart sank. Since Consort Hui already knows why we're here, I'll have to trouble you to pass on a message to His Highness. We'll have to take our leave for now. I can pass on the message, but I cannot guarantee anything else. Understood. After Yang Wanyu finished speaking, she dragged the reluctant Yang Qingxin out. After leaving the residence of Prince Hui, Yang Qingxin glared at her and questioned, "What are you doing? I don't believe they can't even afford to feed us lunch. We've been waiting for him so long, we might as well wait all the way." Yang Wanyu shook her head and brought him to their carriage. After they got on, she told him her guess, "I'm going to the palace to look for the 8th princess and see if she can put in a good word in front of the Empress. You better stay in the carriage and don't run around, understand? If even King Hui doesn't want to interfere, will the 8th princess do so? Let's just give it a try." Yang Wanyu smiled bitterly. After saying that, she requested her coachman to drive them to the palace. When they arrived at the palace gates, Yang Wanyu exited the carriage and went straight to the guards. After reporting her name, she handed over the token the 8th princess gave her. However, she was immediately chased to the side. "Go back. The 8th princess left early in the morning and isn't in the palace." "Where did she go?" "The princess' whereabouts are not something we can inquire about. I should be able to meet the Empress, no? The Empress is in charge of the 6 palaces and is very busy. Not everyone can see her just because they want to. You must have an invitation letter or someone to pick you up." Yang Wanyu pondered to herself. It wasn't so difficult to enter the palace back then. Could they deliberately ask these guards to block her from entering, trying to ignore her entirely? When she thought of this, a wave of hatred rose in her heart. So, they were discarded after their uses were done. Nevertheless, she still tried to persuade the guards. "I'll have to trouble you to help me inform her. No matter what, I'm still Prince Hu's concubine who is about to marry into the family." The guard's eyes flashed with mockery. He couldn't believe she still had the cheek to mention her marriage at such a time. He waved his hand and replied, "You can go and find King Hui then. You can't meet the Empress unless you're summoned." "Yes, yes. King Hui is fine too. Isn't he in the palace too? I'll go look for him." The guard paused momentarily when he heard this, but he quickly understood that even King Hui did not want to see her. He pointed to the opposite side and said, "Go wait outside. I definitely can't let you in at this time." After the guard finished speaking, he ignored her entirely. Yang Wanyu was so angry that she almost wanted to go forward and tear him apart. However, she knew it was useless. She returned to the carriage and waited. Yang Qingxin saw her dejected look and immediately gritted his teeth. "All of them, bastards." Chapter 543 Sending Hotpot to the Palace. "Shut up. Are you trying to go into an early grave too?" Yang Wanyu immediately covered her brother's mouth and growled. Yang Qingxin's head cleared after being yelled at by her. He shut his mouth and stopped talking. Zhou Ying was just about to see King Hu's reaction to Yang Wanya's visit when Shizhu suddenly ran in and said, "Madam, the people from the palace are here to pick you up. They're late. Go and get 2 copper pots for me." She stood up and went to the kitchen immediately. "Sister Haitang, no one came in all this time, right?" "Yes, I'm the only one here stewing the bone soup." "All right then. Come with me to the palace. Remember, don't speak unless I ask you something." "I understand." Haitang responded, then put away the things she had prepared and placed them in a large food box. She called for Shizhu, and the 3 of them walked out together. Granny Lu, who was picking them up, only sized them up briefly before letting them into the carriage. When they got into the carriage, Granny Lu smelled a pungent and spicy smell. "Mrs. Zhou, did you bring your own seasonings?" "No, it's the prepared base and dipping sauce for the hot pot. When stir-frying the spicy base, the smell will be very choking, so one prepared it at home." "I see." Granny Lu nodded and checked the items they brought. After confirming there was nothing extra, she brought them into the palace. After entering the palace, Granny Lu brought them into the small kitchen of Longevity Palace. "All the ingredients are here. You can start preparing. We'll start on time at noon." "Granny Lu, one will need to know how many people will be there so that I can prepare enough ingredients." 2 tables full. Prepare as much meat as possible." "Understood." After Zhou Ying finished speaking, she instructed them to get busy. Shizhu washed the vegetables while Haitang started plating. Zhou Ying cut off the fat and tender meat from 2 sheep, shaved them into thin slices, and handed them to Haitang for plating. After the hot pot was served, Zhou Ying baked some scallion pancakes for the palace servants to bring in. Soon after, Granny Lu entered and informed Mrs. Zhou, "Mrs. Zhou, the Empress Dowager said today is a family banquet, so she won't invite you in, but the rest of the mutton is all yours." She gave her 100 taels of silver after taking it out. "This is for the copper pot. The Empress Dowager said they would have to bother you if they wanted to eat it again in the future. Granny Lu, please help me thank the Empress Dowager." Zhou Ying added, "There's still some minced meat, so 111 make meatball soup. You can taste my cooking this way too." "Can't wait." Granny Lu immediately nodded and smiled. The taste of the spicy hot pot was too tempting. She had long wanted to try it but was embarrassed to ask. "Please wait a moment." Zhou Ying smiled and nodded, then turned around and got busy. A pot of steaming mutton meatballs and radish soup was served in a short while. The fresh fragrance of the mutton and radish fused together into a tempting mix. Zhou Ying looked at Granny Liu's twitching nose and laughed secretly. She said, "Granny Liu, please enjoy. Well, go back now. You had a busy day, so let's share a meal. When we're done, I'll send you out together." Granny Liu spoke quickly. Shizu's stomach grumbled at this moment, and she could only nod in agreement. Naturally, Granny Liu still delivered the majority of the soup to the dining area. The remaining food was only then consumed by the 4 women with a sizable scallion pancake. After getting her fill, Zhou Ying used her spiritual sense to scan the place while leaving the palace. She found the Empress Dowager, the Emperor, the Empress, and the young princes and princesses all inside, including the 8th princess, who had been arranged to go to the hot spring manor. Because of the slow boiling of the hot pot, a few of them even started to fight over the readied meat. It was a lively scene. It was probably a rare occasion for the royal family. Zhou Ying smiled. She turned to Gu Qingrui and said, "Oh right, Wanning and her brother are here. Go and greet them. We'll start grilling these skewers when the charcoal is lit." "Sure. I'll stay behind and help you roast these skewers. You know how good my skills are. Ha ha ha, as long as you don't burn it, it's all good." Zhou Ying smiled. Gu Qingrui smiled and walked straight into the house. Seeing Gu Qingrui enter, Yang Wanning introduced Mrs. Sun to him. Mrs. Sun walked over and knelt. She choked, "Third young master, you have to stand up for madam. She died an unjust death. Please, get up. There are guests. If there's anything you need my help for, let's talk after dinner." Gu Qingrui helped her up. At the same time, he felt her pulse and was shocked. "Do you have stomach problems?" "Yes, I've been starving intermittently over the past few years, so my stomach has developed some problems. You have to take better care of yourself. I'll prescribe you a few prescriptions later." "Thank you, third young master." Chapter 656 Talking it out. Sit down and have a cup of tea first. 111 Go change my clothes. After Gu Qingrui finished speaking, he entered his room and placed a title deed under his pillow. He quickly changed into relatively thin clothes and washed up before walking back out. The charcoal was ready, and Yang Wanning was about to get up and help. Gu Qingrui stopped her. "Qinglin and Wen will go over. You all wait in the house." Young Qinglin immediately stood up and followed Gu Qingrui out. Seeing Zhou Ying and the others roasting skewers, young Qinglin asked in surprise, "Is this smoked meat edible?" "You'll know when you try it. It's very delicious." Gu Qingrui turned his head and asked, "One heard there would be an exam next spring. How are the preparations going?" "It's going well, but I don't know if one can still participate." Young Qinglin replied with a smile. No matter what, Madame Cui was his grandmother, and Mrs. Cui was his stepmother. They had committed a major crime. He would have to miss his exams because of filial piety, even if the emperor did not punish them. Of course, there was one other possibility, and that was to get an opportunity to cut off relations with the Yang family. He just didn't know if they could succeed in doing so. Gu Qingrui paused momentarily, remembered their situation, and felt sorry for him. He patted his little shoulder and said, "Take your time. There's no need to rush. Gold will always shine, so you just have to be prepared. You just have to always be prepared for a chance to soar into the sky. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to shine even if the opportunity was given to you." "Yeah, I know." Young Qinglin nodded in agreement, then looked at him with admiration. After all, Gu Qingrui was one of them. The Gu family situation was much more severe than the Yang families back then. Didn't Gu Qingrui not give up? Instead, he was ready for any opportunity, which led to his current status. Gu Qingrui felt a little guilty under Yang Qinglin's gaze of worship. He was where he was today not only because of those 3 years of study but also because of his experiences in his previous life over the past 30 years. "What are you two brothers talking about? You're having a good time?" Zhou Huiming asked curiously as he clumsily flipped the skewers. "It's just a casual chat." "Why is the guest cooking?" "Let me do it." Gu Qingrui stepped forward and said to him. Wait. With you guiding me by my side, this is a perfect learning opportunity. That way, I can make it for myself next time." "Alright, then I'll pass you the sauces." Gu Qingrui found a spoon and started making a bowl of noodles for Mrs. Sunday. He then took 2 steamed buns and roasted them on a skewer. Of course, he only sprinkled some pepper and salt on them. Young Qinglin looked at Zhou Ying skillfully roasting the skewers and went forward to ask, "Can one give it a try?" "Of course, but everyone is waiting to eat. You should wait until everyone is almost done eating before giving it a try." Zhou Ying replied as she sprinkled some seasoning on the mutton skewers and placed them on a plate. "Bring this into the house for your sister and Mrs. Sunday." "All right." Young Qinglin nodded repeatedly. At the same time, he was enamored by the fragrance of the mutton skewers. Just as he was about to leave, Gu Qingrui called out to him. He placed the charred bun slices on the plate and said, "Mrs. Sun has stomach problems, so tell her to eat fewer mutton skewers, okay?" "I understand." Yang Qinglin nodded, then carried the plate into the house. Gu Qingrui returned to his room and brought out an additional small table. He also brought out a jar of wine as he taught Zhou Huiming to roast the skewers. The two of them sat at the small table and ate while roasting. Chapter 546 Cause of Death. Alright, let's keep our mouths focused on eating it while it's hot, Zhou Luaming said as he bit into a freshly roasted lamb skewer. Of course, everything is delicious when it's just out of the pot, Gu Qingrui replied with a smile. He raised his glass and added, "Don't just eat meat. It's more delicious when combined with a mouthful of wine." True. Eating too much mutton will make you sick of it. One need to drink some wine to wash it down. Zhou Luaming raised his small wine cup and drank it in one gulp. He then raised his head and asked, "By the way, when will you be able to sell your greenhouse vegetables? You must leave some for me." Vegetables grown in greenhouses have a similar growth period as those grown on land. Other than cabbage and bakoi, I'm afraid you won't be able to enjoy the rest before the new year. That's good enough. At least one can see greens in my meal in the middle of winter. You have to leave some for me when the time comes. Of course, no problem. If you're not busy, you can help me sell it to the others too. Easy. It's just a matter of getting the word out. I'm afraid there won't be enough for it to go around. The rarer an item is, the more valuable it is. That's true. Zhou waited for them to stop and asked, "Brother Zhou, how are the roses selling? Can they be sold at a high price?" Wild roses were the primary source of income for Sinan village. Their lives would be difficult if they could not sell for a high price. Why don't you take a guess? Zhou Luihing turned his head and asked. One heard from Mingyu that I couldn't buy it even if one wanted to. I think it shouldn't be bad. That's right. It was initially sold for nearly half a tael of silver per pound. Later, many women and young ladies realized its effectiveness and gradually raised the price. By the time you returned to the capital, 1 tael of rose tea was selling for 1 tael of silver. Even this was barely enough. The tea house bought the last 10 pounds at a high price the day before yesterday. Looks like Sinan village is saved. Yeah, let them take good care of those wild roses. That's their treasure. I'll write a letter to Hu Chun later. Gu Qingrui nodded in agreement. Soon, Yang Qinglin ran out and tried roasting the meat. Once Zhou estimated that everyone had eaten enough, she baked steamed buns and sweet potato slices and brought them into the house. After dinner, they sent Zhou Luaming off, and the couple handed the stall over to Hai Tang and her husband before returning home. Seeing Yang Qinglin, who was so sleepy that he could not open his eyes, Gu Qingrui said, "Qinglin, go inside to sleep." "Cousin, there's no need. After we're done, we still have to rush back home," Yang Wanning said. When Yang Qinglin heard that, he immediately stood up, despite being extremely sleepy. "Tell me, what exactly happened?" Gu Qingrui sat down with Zhou and asked. Madam was killed." When Mrs. Sun said this, she started crying. When Yang Wanning and her brother heard this, they started tearing up. Zhou had no choice but to hand each of them a handkerchief. After they recovered, Mrs. Sun continued, "Ever since the incident in the Gu family, Master gradually began alienating Madam, which put her on guard. But although Master alienated her and Mrs. and Madam Chui made things difficult for her, Madam gradually relaxed her vigilance after realizing there was no bodily harm. It was not until last winter that Madam felt her condition worsening, so she found a doctor. The doctor claimed Madam had overeaten cold or chilly food, which caused her body to get chilly and her blood vessels blocked. That was why her health was deteriorating. Later, he prescribed some medicine for Madame to drink. Her health improved slightly at first, but the medicine stopped when the snowstorm arrived. The charcoal supply stopped, so her health took a sharp turn. One night, she passed away from the chill when the fireplace ran out of charcoal. Chapter 547 Analysis. I heard from Yang Wanyu, who let it slip accidentally, that Mrs. Chui cut off my mother's charcoal. There was also the chili food that Mrs. Sun mentioned. If incorrect, it should be the hardy ice plant. Yang Wanning said angrily. Gu Qingrui looked at Mrs. Sun and asked, "Did you find out what the chili food the doctor was referring to was?" "No, we didn't find anything after 3 days of investigation." Of course, it's also possible that someone found out and replaced them. Mrs. Sun looked at Yang Wanning and continued, "As for the hardy ice plant you mentioned, I have never seen it before, so I don't know if it's true." Gu Qingrui nodded and looked at Yang Wanning. "Wanning, what do you plan to do next?" "Qinglin, you too. Tell me what you think." "I want to sever all ties with the Yang family. Cousin, please help me bring that scholar over tomorrow." "Oh, where do you plan to expose Mrs. Chui?" "My father will definitely be there to collect their corpses, so one want to cut off all ties with him before that. We don't want to be in mourning for those two, and we don't want to get dragged down by them. Yeah, otherwise, we'll be acknowledging the thief as our mother." Zhou agreed with them wholeheartedly. After all, the emperor had already begun investigating Yang Shiqing's corruption. Once he was found guilty, they were likely to face beheading or exile, which was worse than the Gu family. She reminded the siblings, "With only this evidence, I'm afraid you won't be able to leave the Yang family. At most, you can deny having Mrs. Chui as your mother. You won't even be able to get rid of your grandmother. Yes, with the current evidence, I'm afraid it's not enough for you to leave the Yang family." Gu Qingrui nodded in agreement. Even when Gu Qingrui and Zhou were kicked out of the family with nothing after almost getting killed, the patriarch tried to persuade them to make peace, not to mention that the Yang siblings had no evidence that Yang Shiqing had harmed or even abused them. Yang Wanning was stunned after hearing that and a little discouraged. "How can we sever our relationship? First, the elder must take the initiative to abandon you, but your reputation will be damaged. Second, you can point out that Yang Shiqing is a fatal danger to you and that you have no choice but to do so in order to survive. Although this would affect your reputation, a reasonable person would see your hardship." Gu Qingrui explained seriously. "Of course, if you can be on the side of justice and create a scene, then being abandoned by your father will attract sympathy from the people instead. It'll depend on how you play this out." Zhou echoed. "I understand. Thank you. I'll go back and think about it seriously." Yang Wanning nodded thoughtfully. She got up after that. Cousin-in-law, you've been busy the whole day. Rest early. Well, head home now. I'll send you guys home. It's on the way to King Rui's place, and one can ask for that scholar." Gu Qingrui stood up and offered. "Thank you for helping out." Yang Wanning thanked Gu Qingrui and left with Yang Qinglin and Mrs. Sunday. After they left, Zhou sat down on a chair and drank her tea. After that, she called for the bath to be ready and happily took a flower bomb bath. Gu Qingrui returned home just as she was done. Zhou went forward to take his cloak and hang it at the side before asking, "Is it done?" "Yes, King Rui has sent someone to the manor to pick up the scholar. He will be entering the capital at around 7 tomorrow morning. Do you want to take a bath? It's lovely." Gu Qingrui hesitated for a moment before agreeing. "Sure. I'll go prepare some wormwood leaves." Chapter 548 Great Evil. After Gu Qingrui finished his bath, he entered his bedroom and saw Zhou Ying leaning against the headboard and reading a book. Under the light, she looked like a pixie, smiling seductively. She stretched out her claws and pounced on him with a laugh. After a hearty exercise, Gu Qingrui took the title deed under his pillow and said, "This is the title deed for the land I went to see today. It's a total of 2,200 acres. Oh, it's finally transferred. Where did you get the silver?" Zhou Ying looked at her name and asked, surprised. "Brother Zhou gave me the money from the wild rose sale. One didn't take the rest and gave it to him as his commission." "How much did it sell in total?" 4,300 taels. The manor was sold as barren land, so it cost 2,200 taels. Not bad. Well, split it equally. After Zhou Ying finished speaking, she put the title deed into her interspace. After that, she used her divine sense to look outside. After confirming that Shizhu had left, the two entered her interspace. After finishing her work, Zhou Ying took a glance at the Yang residence. The Yang siblings and Yang Qingxin were already asleep. Only Yang Wanyu was still rummaging through the old madam's room. After ensuring the siblings were safe, Zhou Ying left and collected another batch of vegetables. She washed a tomato and ate it after that. The interspace's tomato was delicious, sweet, and sour. The texture was not inferior to eating a watermelon. She washed a few more, cut them into slices, and mixed them with white sugar. When Gu Qingrui returned, she served them for supper. The next morning, Gu Qingrui had returned from morning court when Zhou Ying woke up. After they finished breakfast, Zhou Ying asked, "Rui, has that scholar arrived in the capital?" "He's here. We can go pick him up anytime." Gu Qingrui added with a complicated expression, "The first prince has pleaded for mercy on behalf of Mrs. and Madame Cui today. He hoped that their punishment could be changed to exile instead." "That's strange. Yang Wanyu looked for him for half a day yesterday, but he didn't show up. Maybe he didn't think of a perfect solution." "So what did the emperor say?" "Of course he rejected it, and he publicly announced the evil deeds of the Cui family. Just the number of girls that were forcefully sold by them surpassed more than 1,000. What about the third prince? Did he help?" "Kinda. He said that after such a disastrous year, it's not suitable for blood to spill again. Beheading might not be too suitable." In the end, after the discussion amongst the ministers, their sentence was changed to hanging. Hanging isn't that even worse than beheading? They'll have to suffer for quite a while. Who asked them to commit such a heinous crime? True. Zhou Ying nodded in agreement. The Cui family had done so many evil things. In her opinion, it was not an exaggeration to burn them at the stake. After lunch, Gu Qingrui went to the government office. Zhou Ying brewed a pot of tea and took a book as a cover to look at the Yang residence. This was Yang Wanning's first major event. Zhou Ying needed to see if Yang Wanning could defend herself, if she were smart enough, or if it was worth it to help her all the way to the end. Yang Wanning and Yang Qinglin had just finished their lunch when Aunt Ning and her daughter walked in, followed by two childless aunts. When Yang Wanning saw everyone, she stood up and asked, "Why are all of you gathered here at my place?" "I asked them to come over. Grandmother and mother are going to be beheaded at noon. We have to discuss what to do, right?" Yang Wanyu walked in, followed by Yang Qingxin, who had a gloomy aura. Chapter 549 Relationships Come in then. Yang Wanyu invited them into her room. After everyone sat down, Yang Wanyu looked at Yang Wanning and said, "You're the eldest. Tell us what we should do. Since you've gathered everyone together, you must have an idea. I want to hear what you think." Yang Wanning immediately kicked the ball back to her. She did not even want to acknowledge Mrs. and Madame Cui as her family, so she would not interfere in their matters. Young Wanyu had no choice, so she stood up and said, "One think we should go to the emperor together." Grandmother and mother must have been dragged down by the Chui family. After she finished speaking, no one agreed with her. Young Wanyu looked at Young Wanning and asked, "What do you think, big sister? Do you think it will work?" Instead of asking the emperor to change his sentence, one think it would be better to ask King An to release father first. Father knows more and has more connections. Yes, one think what she said makes sense. We have no position to speak of and no one to lead us. We can't even enter the palace. Mrs. Ning echoed. The elderly Mrs. Zhang, sitting at the side, had a blank expression on her face. She had no intention of participating at all. The younger Mrs. Xiao gloated and said, "One also agree with her." She looked at Yang Wanyu and added, "One heard that you and your brother not only went to look for Prince Hui yesterday but also went to the palace gate to look for the 8th princess and empress. I heard you didn't even meet a single person after all that. This should tell you that this matter is very troublesome. If even the empress and the first prince can't change their fates, we probably won't be able to achieve anything, even if we kneel to our deaths at the palace gates." "You," Yang Wanyu glared at Mrs. Xiao. Mrs. Xiao smiled. "I'm telling the truth. From the looks of it, it's useless to do anything now. It's better to think of a way to gather some silver to buy 2 coffins. If you're not willing to help, then get out. You're not the only one here to help." Yang Qingsen stood up and chastised her. "I wish you good luck." Mrs. Xiao turned around and walked out. Mrs. Zhang immediately followed her. As for Mrs. Ning, she hesitated momentarily before sitting back down. She looked at the siblings and said, "Mirrors. Zhao's words may sound unpleasant, but we've already begged everyone we can. Since there's no change, we must prepare for the worst. You guys." Yang Wanyu saw no one supporting saving her mother and immediately ran out angrily. Yang Qingsen huffed and followed. Mrs. Ning stood up and said, "Sorry for disturbing you. You're too polite." Yang Wanning stood up and sent her out. She went inside to find Mrs. Sun and asked, "Mrs. Sun, do you know them? Does Mrs. Xiao have a grudge with Mrs. Chui? When the Gu family was in trouble, Mrs. Xiao had a miscarriage. The rumors were that cats raised by Mrs. Chui caused it. As for whether it was on purpose, it was not confirmed. But from then on, Mrs. Xiao hated her. Mrs. Xiao is also a strong person. She relied on your father's favor to resist the suppression of Mrs. and Madame Chui. As for Mrs. Zhang, she's also a poor person. She was another woman the old madam arranged for master after your mother got pregnant. However, after so many years, she had never borne a child. Madam could not bear it anymore and finally promoted her to a concubine. As for Mrs. Ning, she moved into the residence 8 years ago. It was said she had connections with the Empress family, so she held some status here. All these years, she stayed out of the fight to protect herself. However, judging from what she said just now, she was probably trying to take advantage of the situation to be the main wife. Chapter 550 Disappointed Main Wife. What else does the Yang residence even have left? Even my father's official position might be gone. Yang Wanning sneered. No matter what, before you leave the Yang family, try not to get into conflict with her. I understand. You should take a rest. Other than Chuanxi and me, don't believe anyone else's words in this courtyard. Yang Wanning then turned and walked away. She saw Yang Qinglin sitting in the room. Qinglin, go change into dark clothes and gather at the stable. Well, go to the Ministry of Justice soon. Got it, sister. Yang Qinglin went to get ready after that. Yang Wanning changed into a set of blue clothes and went to the stable. When Yang Qinglin arrived, the siblings entered the carriage and headed straight for the Ministry of Justice. They went straight to Qing'an after arriving at the Ministry of Justice, but he wasn't there. Just as the two were about to leave, Qing'an walked in. When he saw the siblings, he paused and asked, "Why are you two little fellows here? What's the matter?" "Greetings, Qing'an." The two of them hurriedly bowed. "Please, get up. If you have something to say, just say it," Qing'an said. "Later in the afternoon, our grandmother and mother will be beheaded. We came here to ask if you can release our father so he can send them on their last journey." Yang Wanning requested. "Come with me." Qing'an walked out and added, "I've just asked the emperor about this. The emperor allowed him out, but he cannot leave the capital. I'm afraid your grandmother and mother can't be sent back to their hometown for their burial." "Thank you." Yang Wanning thanked Qing'an. Qing'an only smiled when he heard that. He then brought the siblings to the prison cell. Seeing Yang Shiqing sitting cross-legged facing the wall, Qing'an paused momentarily and said, "Yang Shiqing, you're out of here." The warden immediately opened the cell door. Yang Shiqing was shocked for a moment. He then stood up and walked over to greet Qing'an. "Thank you, Qing'an. All right, enough with the pleasantries. Today, your mother, wife, and the Chui family will be beheaded. Go send them on their journey." After Qing'an finished speaking, he walked out. "Yes." Yang Shiqing responded and immediately followed. When he passed Yang Wanning and Yang Qinglin, he glanced at them but ignored them and walked out. Yang Qinglin, who had been looking forward to meeting his father, suddenly felt disappointed when he saw Yang Shiqing's attitude. No matter what, they had to come to pick him up, but he didn't even respond to their arrival. Yang Wanning saw his aggrieved face and rubbed his hair. She pulled on his sleeve and followed the men. When they arrived outside, they saw that Yang Shiqing was nowhere to be seen, so they entered their carriage. When they saw Yang Shiqing sitting inside expressionlessly, the two of them came up and called out to him before asking the coachman to hurry back. After leaving the Ministry of Justice, Yang Wanning turned her head and asked, "Father, are we going back home directly?" "Yes." Yang Shiqing replied as he lifted the curtain and looked outside. After finding that the streets had been cleared, he knew that the people of the Chui family would be escorted to the execution ground soon. "Where are Wan Yu and Chengsen?" "I don't know." Previously, Wan Yu wanted to unite everyone at home to kneel before the imperial palace and beg the emperor for mercy. However, one and the other concubines agreed to ask for your opinion before deciding, so they ran away. "Nonsense." Yang Shiqing immediately said this with a gloomy face. The emperor had even arrested him when he had no evidence of his crimes. The emperor was obviously using them as a warning to the others. How could he let go of the two main culprits, Mrs. and Madame Chui? Pleading for mercy would only ruin the Yang residents further. Chapter 551. It's useless to beg anyone. Yang Wanning didn't say anything to that. Seeing this, Yang Shiqing had no intention of asking any more questions. Instead, he asked the coachman to speed up. After returning to the residence, Yang Shiqing washed up and ate. He changed into black clothes and gathered everyone in the manor. Yang Wanning looked at his outfit and understood what he meant. However, Yang Wanyu was still blind to it. Or rather, she didn't want to understand it. She only wanted to save her grandmother and mother so that she could maintain her good life. Therefore, when she saw Yang Shiqing, it was as if she had seen a savior. She immediately pounced over. "Father, quickly think of a way to save grandmother and mother." "That's right, father. Otherwise, it will be too late." Yang Qingsen echoed. "Shut up, all of you. The announcement has been issued. You think it's a joke? It's useless to beg anyone now." Yang Shiqing replied with a dark face. When young Wanyu heard his words, the last straw broke the camel's back. She sat on the ground and cried like a wronged child. She cried without caring about her image. Zhou felt a little sad, but she also knew that her feelings for them were mixed, so she did not have the slightest sympathy. Although young Qingsen didn't cry, he silently wiped away his tears. The more he wiped away his tears, the more his dams were about to burst. "Shut up!" Young Shiqing shouted with a headache. He called his butler over and gave him 500 taels of silver. Buy 2 black wood coffins, then buy 16 cedar wood coffins. If you don't have enough silver, ask them to put it on the tab. I understand. The butler replied, then took the silver notes and rushed out. When Yang Wanyu saw the banknotes in Yang Shiqing's hands, her crying became softer until it was completely silent. Yang Shiqing didn't think much about it and thought she was tired from crying. He turned around and said, "All right, follow me to the execution ground and send off my mother and madam." Young Qingsen wanted to refuse but was stopped by Yang Wanning. Young Shiqing did not cause trouble for them after he came out, so they shouldn't take the initiative to cause trouble. Otherwise, this would leave a mark on their reputation, affecting their future. She had to find another suitable opportunity. Moreover, she could help her mother see the outcome of Mrs. and Madame Cui. Instead, Mrs. Ning opened her mouth and said, "Master, Wanru is only 6 years old. She shouldn't go. It would be bad if she got traumatized." After hearing this, Yang Shiqing was originally unhappy, but he turned his head and met Yang Wanru's innocent eyes. He simply nodded and replied, "She stays." The group of people walked out solemnly after that. Chapter 552 Public anger. The public threw the stuff in their hands harder and harder at them. The 3-year-old kid at the back was originally watching the show. Soon, he was hit on the head, and a red bump immediately appeared. He grimaced in pain. He started cursing, "Who hit me? Stand out. I'll break your legs. Beast, such a beast. Even a child can say such words. No wonder he's also sentenced to death. Indeed, look at his fierce appearance. One look, and you can tell that he's not a good person. Like father, like son. It's fortunate that he's going to be executed, otherwise, he'll be another criminal in the future." The child's mother listened to the people's discussions but was too lazy to argue or turn around to comfort her child. Instead, she silently and numbly shed tears. The members of the Cui family were cursed and smashed with stones all the way. Finally, they arrived at the execution ground in half an hour. Soon, young Shiqing and the others also rushed over. "Master! Master! Save me! Save me!" Mrs. Cui shouted when she saw him. Young Shiqing shook his head and pulled Yang Qingsen to stand under the execution platform. Seeing this, Mrs. Cui burst into tears. Previously, she had heard that many other families also offered loans. Why was it that when others were fine, they had to die here? She couldn't understand why they ended up this way. Her husband was clearly fine. Why couldn't he think of a way to save them? Yang Wanyu wanted to go forward, but she didn't dare take another step forward when she saw the soldiers guarding the side. She just stared at them silently. At this moment, the members of the Cui family started to curse Mrs. and Madame Cui. They wouldn't have ended up here if they hadn't asked them to get involved in the loan shark business. When it was close to noon, the supervisor of the execution, Kingen, and 2 officials from the Ministry of Justice walked over. One of the officials first emphasized the rules to maintain order. Then, another person announced their crimes. Some onlookers who had pitied them were enraged when they heard about their crimes, especially when they realized they had trafficked many women. All of them wanted to go up and beat them up. This was especially true for Mrs. and Madame Chui. Some even threw large rocks at them. King turned to look at the hourglass and asked, "Are there any objections?" "If there are no objections, prepare the execution." In addition, someone suggested that the country had just stabilized and wasn't ready for bloodshed, so their execution by beheading was changed to hanging. As soon as he finished speaking, 4 gallows were carried up by the bailiffs. The people below immediately started discussing animatedly. Chapter 553 Execution, Shut Up. One of the soldiers saw Mrs. Chui shouting non-stop, so he stepped forward and kicked her down. Mrs. Chui simply crawled on the ground and wailed louder. At the same time, she was filled with regret. She regretted helping Yang Shiqing do so much dirty work but was abandoned at her final moment. In fact, she ended up worse than Mrs. Gu. At least Mrs. Gu died in their residence and had a grand funeral. As for her, it would be good if Yang Shiqing could even bury her in a decent coffin. She even left her son with the crime of being the descendant of a sinner. If there weren't any major turns of events, it would be difficult for him to pursue an official career. Seeing this, the members of the Chui family also realized that they were out of hope this time. All of them started crying. As they cried, the murmuring below the execution platform gradually stopped. As for Yang Wanyu, she looked at Mrs. Cui's despairing wails and silently shed tears. Madame Chui stared at the crowd below numbly, her mind was replaying her life. When she was young, her family valued boys over girls. At a young age, she was already a good helper at home and outside. When she married a scholar from a good family, she thought she could finally live a good life. Who knew her husband would die of illness when Yang Shiqing was just 1 month old? Later on, she did the best she could. She finally raised Yang Shiqing to be a man and got him to marry a golden goose like Mrs. Gu. Her days soared into the sky. She never expected that she would end up like this. What happened? Now that she thought about it, it was all because of dissatisfaction, resentment, and greed. They wouldn't have come to this if they hadn't dabbled in the loan shark business. Listening to all kinds of complaints and curses from her family members, she ignored them. Yes, she didn't want to bother with anyone anymore. If they didn't exist, if they didn't keep asking for money, if they didn't betray her, she wouldn't have been pushed to the execution ground today. In this life, she never owed any of her family members. The only one to whom she was genuinely indebted was Mrs. Gu. Although she had snatched her imperial mandate, she had helped pave the way for her son's official career, given them a stable and wealthy life, and even left a son and a daughter for the Yang family. She had done everything she could for the Yang family, but they... At the thought of this, Madame Chui finally shed tears of regret. King An threw down a warrant and announced, "Begin the execution." As soon as the warrant landed, 8 soldiers stepped forward and grabbed the 4 youngest members of the Chui family, placing them on the gallows. Perhaps it was because they were young that their execution process was exceptionally quick. However, the agonizing struggle before death caused deep despair in everyone who was waiting for their turn. The timid ones were so terrified that they peed their pants. However, no matter their thoughts or reactions, they were still hung on the gallows. In the end, there were only 2 left, Mrs. and Madame Chui. Madame Chui was already numb to the outside world, and Mrs. Chui was on the verge of insanity. When they were placed on the gallows, Mrs. Chui saw her tearful children and the expressionless Yang Shiqing. She also saw Yang Wanning and her brother, who showed no expressions. Thinking about her children's future, she couldn't leave like this. Otherwise, Yang Shiqing would give up on them very soon. Therefore, she immediately shouted, "Master, Master! It's Mrs. Gu." This is all her revenge. The surrounding onlookers were stunned by her words, not knowing what she meant. This pissed off Yang Wanning, but simultaneously, she realized this was a golden opportunity. Just as King An was about to declare her execution, Yang Wanning rushed forward and said, "Wait a minute." Chapter 554 Questioning, what is it? King An looked at her unhappily. Please let her speak. One can't let her frame my mother for no reason. Yang Wanning looked at Mrs. Chui and said, King An is here, father is here, and many others are here too. You must make yourself clear today. What did my mother do to make you try to smear her name before your death? If you don't clarify, don't even think about dying painlessly. Wanning, come down. She's your mother. Yang Shiqing shouted. She's not worthy of being my mother. I won't acknowledge a person who wants to kill me, my brother, and even try to frame my mother before she dies. Yang Wanning shook her head. Don't spout nonsense. You didn't even ask her anything. How do you know if she's talking nonsense, or maybe you know if she's telling the truth? The people below listened and immediately clamored to support Yang Wanning. All of a sudden, the voices of the people united. Their voices grew louder and louder until they reached a deafening level. When King An saw this, he immediately stood up. Taking advantage of the pause between their shouts, he roared, "Stop, all of you, stop." He approached Mrs. Chui and said, Mrs. Chui, I'm now asking you as a judge of the Ministry of Justice. Tell me what you mean by what you said earlier. Mrs. Chui didn't know what to say. She couldn't say she dreamed that Mrs. Gu wanted to kill her, right? Wouldn't that indirectly admit that she killed Mrs. Gu? She never expected Yang Wanning to dare to barge onto the execution platform. Before she could say anything, Yang Shiqing came up and said, Your Highness, she's just rambling before her death. Let's execute her, otherwise, it will be getting late. King An looked at Yang Wanning after hearing that. From her words, Mrs. Chui may have more evidence of her crimes. In addition to Mrs. Gu's relationship with King An's mother, he planned to help Yang Wanning out. There's no hurry. Since she spoke out, one want to get to the end of this today. I can't let my mother be framed for a groundless crime. Yang Wanning looked at Yang Shiqing firmly. Yang Shiqing glared at her, trying to indicate that she shouldn't pursue the matter any further. He wanted Mrs. Chui to refrain from speaking again. It would get him killed if Mrs. Chui couldn't take the pressure and said something she shouldn't. However, Yang Wanning ignored his looks and looked at Mrs. Chui. Why? Cat got your tongue. Why aren't you saying anything? She had to clear up any misunderstandings today. Otherwise, it would be up to everyone's imagination once Mrs. Chui was executed. Yang Wanning and her brother would be in a bad position at that time. Yang Wanyu was also extremely anxious, but she dared not go up on stage because she knew what Yang Wanning said was true. She was afraid that she would get implicated. Yang Qingsen wanted to go up, but he was held down firmly by Yang Qinglin. Mrs. Zhao and Mrs. Ning were happy at this turn of events, but they had no intention of going upstage. King An said to an official on the right, "Record it." He then gave the two soldiers beside him a look. Yes. The official replied and sat down at the table, preparing his stationery. The two soldiers also came forward and took Yang Shiqing to the side. They covered his mouth and guarded him. His struggles were useless. Mrs. Chui saw Yang Shiqing could no longer help and had no choice but to tell everyone about the night before the robbery in their residence and her dream of Mrs. Gu. However, she hid the fact that Mrs. Gu was coming to her for revenge. Yang Wanning asked quickly, "So, you must have been frightened by my mother seeking her revenge." Chapter 555 Warning, there's no such thing. Mrs. Chui quickly denied this. However, the uneasiness in her eyes was clearly seen by King An. It seemed she may have caused Mrs. Gus' death. This meant he did not have to be polite any further. He looked at Yang Wanning and asked, "Do you have any evidence?" "She did harm my mother, but one don't have conclusive evidence for her murder. But one have evidence of the person who harmed me. As for corrupting my brother heard it with his ears." "I knew of this too," Yang Wanning said. "Did you bring your evidence?" "No, I originally intended to let go of this since she's getting executed. Since she would be executed in such a disgraceful way, for my father's sake, I didn't want to pursue the matter. But since she wanted to drag my mother's name through the mud before her death, I can't tolerate this anymore." Yang Wanning wiped her tears and continued, "All my evidence and witnesses are ready for presentation any time. Speak, one will send someone to get them." King An quickly called a team of soldiers over. Yang Wanning turned around and led a group of soldiers to the side. She told them the location of her evidence and witnesses in a low voice. After the soldiers heard this, they greeted King An and quickly galloped away on their horses. Mrs. Chui was panicking at this moment. She did not expect Yang Wanning to have gathered witnesses and evidence of her crimes. When did she start collecting them, and how much did she collect? What should she do? "Wanning, don't forget that your surname is Yang." Madame Chui warned Yang Wanning. She didn't want to bother, but she spoke up when she considered Yang Shiqing's future. "Of course, I know my surname is Yang. But no matter what, I can't just watch my mother's name get dragged through the mud. For example, if someone claimed you murdered my grandfather, do you think my father would not care? From the moment you forced me to ask King Rui for his betrothal gifts to subsidize Yang Wanyas, our relationship was over. Moreover, since we were young, you've never liked us siblings. Especially me. You never even gave me a piece of candy. You won't deny this, right?" Madame Chui looked at Yang Wanning's cold gaze and could only turn her head away and ignore her. She then gave Mrs. Chui a look. When Mrs. Chui received her gaze, her heart turned cold. However, for the sake of her two children's future, she finally compromised. As long as she refused to admit it, no one could do anything to her. These exchanges did not escape Yang Wanning's eyes, but she ignored them. It didn't matter to her how many crimes she could convict the soon-to-be executed Mrs. Chui of because she just wanted to leave the Yang family. Once word got out today, not many people would believe that Mrs. Chui was innocent. Sure enough, the crowd was in an uproar. They booed Mrs. and Madame Chui and even Yang Shiqing. They knew it was impossible for him not to know about this happening in his household. Those who knew his background immediately spat in disdain. After all, he was a typical example of someone who relied on his in-laws to start his career. It was shameful for him to treat his first wife and two children like this. Of course, there was no shortage of gossip in the capital. In a short while, a ton of old gossip was dug up. Most of them were about stepmothers abusing stepsons, daughters bullying illegitimate children, etc. About 15 minutes later, the guards rushed over with Yang Wanning's evidence and witnesses. Of course, Gu Qingrui and King Rui, who had been informed in advance, also rushed over. King Rui did not approach the execution ground. Instead, he stopped in an alley a distance away. After the witnesses and evidence were brought up, Yang Wanning pointed at the scholar and explained loudly how Mrs. Chui and her daughter plotted against her marriage. Chapter 556. Not admitting. King An looked at the scholar and asked, "Is what Miss Yang told the truth?" The scholar pointed at a woman and said, "Yes, she is the one who came to me. She asked me to ruin Miss Yang's innocence and then marry her. However, before I could make a move, one was discovered by King Rui's convoy." Yang Wanning pointed at another woman and said, "This is Mrs. Cui's personal maid, Mrs. Shin. She's the one who sent someone to put hardy ice plant in my tea leaves." "Is it true?" King An looked at Mrs. Shin. Mrs. Shin looked at Ms. Chui and saw that she was staring at her. She knew she wasn't allowed to say anything, so she quickly lowered her head and pretended to be mute. King An shook his head when he saw this. He looked at the servant girl who did the dirty work and asked, "You are the one who put the hardy ice plant into her tea leaves?" "I did it, but I had no choice. Mrs. Shin captured my brother to threaten me." "It doesn't matter, as you're the one who did it. You could have told your missus in advance or stopped her from drinking it after that, but you didn't do it." King An shook his head. Next was the matter of Yang Qinglin getting corrupted. Yang Qinglin personally came up and told King An everything he had heard that day. Finally, he looked at Qing Yangsen and said, "I've always treated you as my younger brother, but you treat me as your enemy. We're no longer brothers. You deserve it. Who asked you to be so stupid? You can't tell north from south after a few compliments. Tisk, are you even any different? Oh my God, wealthy people are sure spoiled. They can even purposefully nurture a spoiled brat. We smaller families can't afford to do this. Money is nothing. What they want is property and status. That is something that no amount of money can buy." Exactly. Besides, he was just a child. How much could he spend? These people just have to raise him until he is too spoiled and make Lord Yang hate him. This would be enough to prevent him from inheriting the family property. Such a vicious stepmother, suppressing the two children with different methods. Most importantly, no one could say anything since she provided everything her stepson wanted. If this really succeeded, she would at most sigh and say that it was sure difficult for her to be a stepmother. She could push all the blame on her away cleanly. Scheming witch. Yeah, and this will get her a good reputation at the same time. Young Wanning was not in the mood to listen to the people's gossip, so she quickly asked Mrs. Sun to explain her situation. Mrs. Sun briefly explained what happened to Mears. Goo. Finally, she pointed at a beggar beside her and said, "That night, the maid on duty was called Suea, but she disappeared the next morning. Her husband, Chiu Xing, stopped us on our way here." "Your Highness, that is indeed the case. When we were returning, this beggar named Chiu Xing blocked our way. A soldier came up and bowed. Chiu Xing kept shaking his head, but he couldn't make a sound." "You're mute?" King An asked thoughtfully. Chiu Xing nodded. He crawled around the ground and found a stone. He started writing on the ground with difficulty. A total of 3 short sentences explained the matter clearly. In the first sentence, Tsuea was instructed by Mrs. Shen to cut off the charcoal. The second sentence explained that they were hunted down after being released from the residence. In the third sentence, it was revealed that he was poisoned to make him mute. After he finished writing, he pointed to his throat and started crying. Seeing this, Yang Qinglin stepped forward and wanted to kick him, but Gu Qingrui stopped him. Now was the time to fight against a common enemy. Chapter 557 Swear King An saw that all the evidence was focused on Mrs. Shin. He looked at Mrs. Shin and asked, "Mrs. Shin, in the face of their accusations, do you admit it?" Mrs. Shin nodded and looked like a pig waiting to be slaughtered. "Who instructed you?" "No one. Madam is my savior, so I only wanted to protect her from harm." "So, you want to take all the blame on yourself?" Yang Wanning gritted her teeth. "I did it, alone." Mrs. Shin raised her head and swept her eyes over her indifferently. Yang Wanning was furious after hearing that. She thought Mrs. Shin would speak up after seeing that Mrs. Chui was on death row. She didn't expect Mrs. Shin to protect Mrs. Chui, even if it meant her death. The relationship between this master and servant was deep. Mrs. Shen was just a widow whom her in-laws chased out. Her maiden family had disappeared because of the disaster, so she had no one related. She did not have anyone who she could be threatened with. Yang Wanning could only look to King An for help. King An also had a headache. Looking at Mrs. Shin, he knew she was unafraid of death. Or rather, she did not care about life and death anymore. It was difficult to get such a person to speak. Yang Wanning saw the difficult position she was in and was at a loss. Gu Qingrui happened to notice the smug look in Mrs. Cui's eyes. However, he couldn't do anything openly in public. At this moment, Zhou Ying's voice suddenly sounded in his mind. Ask her to swear to Mother God, the more deathly her oath, the better. Gu Qingrui was stunned by the suggestion. After he returned to his senses, he was thrilled. He had a strong backer, so there was no reason to be afraid of her not confessing. He looked at Mrs. Shin and spoke up, "Well, put a rest to this if you swear to Mother God that if you are doing this to protect Mrs. Cui, you will be a slave for 10 generations. Swear that your descendants will be slaves for generations. Swear that your family will have no descendants." After hearing this, Mrs. Shin looked at him in shock because his suggestion was vicious. This would render her unable to turn over a new leaf forever. Yang Wanning nodded in agreement and said, "Yes, everyone knows Mother God has manifested her spirit. One thinks she will have her opinion. If you swear, as my cousin said, I will believe you then." Everyone's expression changed immediately when they heard the word Mother God. Of course, most people were excited. They all wanted Mrs. Shin to take this oath. They wanted to see if Mother God would punish these villains or not. Gu Qingrui noticed that Mrs. Shin was staring intently at him. He glanced at her and said, "Don't feel wronged. After all, there are lives on your hands. Since you have sinned, you should be prepared to pay your debts. Yes, swear, swear. As long as you swear, we will believe that Mrs. Cui is innocent." "That's right. Hurry up and swear. We can see if Mother God will care about these things." "Swear, swear, swear." Mrs. Shin looked at the chanting crowd below and did not know what to do. King An crossed his arms and watched the show from the side. If this matter really succeeded, then it meant there would be a way to deal with even the most stubborn criminals in the future. Yang Wanning saw Mrs. Shin was finally panicking and pressed on, "Make an oath. If you dare say it, I'll believe all of this is your doing alone." Mrs. Shin gritted her teeth and glanced at Mrs. Cui. Seeing her staring at her nervously, she finally closed her eyes and said, Mrs. Shin, swear that if I protect Cui Fingji, At this point, she couldn't continue. She was afraid that if Mother God really manifested, she would never have a good life. Just as everyone was about to urge her, a bolt of lightning suddenly struck down in front of Mrs. Chin, scaring her so much that she screamed and immediately fled backwards. Chapter 558. The end of the Cui family. The others weren't any better off either. They were all frightened. This was especially true for the guilty Mrs. Cui. Her originally pale face had turned green from shock. Just as everyone was still recovering from their shock, a aloof-foot-tall phantom of the Mother God appeared in the air and slowly said, "Heaven has long arms. The good will be rewarded with good, while the evil with evil." After saying that, she gradually disappeared. King An, the first to regain his senses, immediately knelt and said, "One bid your farewell, Mother God." With his words, everyone quickly returned to their senses and immediately knelt and kowtowed. Mrs. Shin, on the other hand, had a look of despair on her face. Remembering that she had not finished her oath, she heaved a sigh of relief and kowtowed 3 times to Mrs. Cui. She then kowtowed to Yang Wanning and said, "I'm sorry, young miss, one was wrong. It was Mrs. Cui's instructions to poison Madam and you with the hardy ice plant, cut off Madam's charcoal, and find the scholar to frame you. As for the eldest young master, I only inquired about his whereabouts. I did not participate in anything else." At the same time, young Shiqing almost peed his pants. He never expected Mother God to show herself. Did she know what he had done? Realizing what would happen to him, his legs went weak. Anything else? Yang Wanning looked at Mrs. Shen and asked. Without waiting for her to speak, Mrs. Zhao rushed up and questioned, back then, when one miscarried, was it planned by you and your mistress? Mrs. Shen raised her head, looked at her guiltily, nodded, and replied, yes, back then, Madam found a kind of mint that would attract cats and rubbed it all over your clothes. It really is you. I'm going to kill you. Mrs. Zhao quickly rushed toward Mrs. Cui. She didn't reach for her neck, but she still punched her stomach a few times until she fainted. Do you know where Mrs. Cui hardy ice plant comes from? Yang Wanning asked again. Mrs. Chen shook her head. I'm not sure. One only know that someone sent it over. One don't know anything else. Seeing this, King An took the opportunity to interrogate Mrs. and Madame Cui again, but they refused to give any helpful information regarding Yang Shiqing. He made the two swear, but they ignored him, looking like pigs waiting for slaughter. When King An saw this, he decided it was time for their execution. He was already certain that Yang Shiqing must have participated in the loan shark business. However, he also knew that the emperor had other plans, so he quickly ordered their execution to start. The executioner also hated the two of them very much, so he deliberately slowed down his actions, causing them to suffer greatly. But this time, no one jeered. Instead, everyone was reflecting on whether they had done anything wrong. It would be troublesome if Mother God remembered that. Ultimately, Mrs. Shen and that little servant girl were exiled together. As for the beggar, Qiu Xing, he bit his tongue and committed suicide after witnessing Mrs. Cui's death. When Gu Qingrui saw this, he got someone to buy an ordinary coffin to bury him. After everything was over, the butler quickly arrived with the coffins and shrouds. When Yang Wanning and her brother saw this, they were ready to accompany Gu Qingrui out of there. Stop! Yang Shiqing shouted. We haven't collected your grandmother and mother's bodies yet. We will never admit Mrs. Cui as our mother. As for grandmother, I'm afraid she doesn't want to see us. It's better to let the person she likes collect her corpse. After Yang Wanning finished speaking, she pulled Yang Qinglin away and followed Gu Qingrui. Father, look at them. Yang Wanyu wanted to sow discord between them, but she was frightened by Yang Shiqing's cold gaze. She could only bring Yang Qingsen and the officials to collect the bodies of the Cui family. Chapter 559 Deterrence. After leaving the execution ground, Gu Qingrui turned to look at the siblings and asked, what are you guys thinking? Do you want to go home with me or back to the Yang residence? Let Qinglin go home with you. I'm going back to the Yang residence. After so many things have happened, it's time to end it completely. Yang Wanning replied. I don't want to. Let's shoulder it together. Yang Qinglin shook his head. Be obedient. If anything happens, I won't be able to protect you at all. One don't need your protection. This is our problem, so we have to face it together. Yang Wanning wanted to say something, but Gu Qingrui interrupted her, saying, let him go. He's already a half-grown kid. It's time for him to make his decision. I'll send someone to protect you two in secret. Alright, sorry for the trouble. No worries. Remember, you can resist, but don't take the initiative to stir up trouble. I understand. Yang Wanning, her brother, and Mrs. Sun walked back together. When Gu Qingrui saw this, he turned around and looked for King Rui. Your Highness, the Cui family have all been executed. I heard that Mother God appeared just now. Yes, she also left behind 2 sentences. Heaven has long arms. The good will be rewarded with good, while the evil with evil. Heaven has long arms. Good, good. One hope all the bad people in the world can be brought to justice. Yes, it's just a matter of time. You're optimistic. Let's go. All right. Gu Qingrui replied and climbed into the carriage. After sitting down, he poured himself a cup of tea to warm his hands before briefly explaining what happened to Mrs. Cui. King Rui nodded after listening. The rest is up to you. If you need manpower, remember to let me know. 2 hours later, the capital knew that Mother God had manifested this, saying that good and evil would be rewarded quickly spread. Even children who could not read could clearly repeat her words. However, those who had done something wrong began to tremble. They feared getting struck by lightning. When the emperor received the news, he laughed and said, "Good, good." With the intimidation of Mother God, some people should restrain themselves. He looked at eunuchly, "In a while, pass on my decree. Tomorrow, all the princes must go to the Mother God temple to offer incense and money. This servant will go and give the orders." After eunuchly finished speaking, he turned around and walked out. After he left, the emperor fell silent. He had done many bad things in the past few years and didn't know if Mother God would settle the score with him too. In short, many people had the same mentality, leading to the exceptionally exuberant incense offerings in the various Mother God temples. Chapter 560 A Mockery. Why? Are you bored? Yeah, there's nothing to do. There aren't many people I can talk to in the capital. It's quite boring. Alright, you'll bring them along for a short retreat. Well, come back after Yang Shiqing's problems are over. After the two had dinner, Shouing began to spread out her divine senses to look at Yang Wanning and her brother. Noticing that they were eating dinner, she went to Yang Shiqing and the others. They had already collected all the corpses, stored them in the mortuary, and planned to bury them tomorrow. Although there weren't many people on the streets, Shouing noticed everyone was gossiping about the Yang family. In particular, they were discussing Yang Shiqing. Some said that he persuaded Mrs. Cui to kill Mrs. Gu, some even said he had a part in the plot against Yang Wanning and her brother and that his goal was to take over the entirety of Mrs. Gu's dowry. However, there were also some who thought he was a fool and had been schemed against by his mother and wife. No matter what, he was in a disadvantageous position. The majority labeled him ungrateful and ruthless, while the rest questioned his ability. If he couldn't even know how to manage his family, how could he be an official in the government? Yang Shiqing and his party turned around a corner and bumped into a drunkard. After the drunkard recognized Yang Shiqing, he immediately mocked him, "Minister of Revenue. What a fool. If you can't even see the people around you clearly, why don't you go home and tend the farms instead? What do you know? Get up, get up." The butler pushed the drunkard away. "I don't know anything, but you should. Could it be you really did conspire with Mrs. Cui to commit murder? You're looking for death." Yang Qingxin rushed over and punched him. The drunkard fell to the ground, but he still managed to kick Yang Qingxin. "You must be the son of Mrs. Cui, ruthless as she is. Come, come, hit my head if you date." Yang Qingxin was so angry that he was trembling. He grabbed a stone from the roadside and wanted to throw it at the drunkard's head. Although Yang Shiqing wanted to kill this drunkard himself, he knew that his family could not afford to stir up any more trouble. He immediately grabbed Yang Qingxin's arm and said, "Stop, why are you bickering with a drunkard?" After saying that, he quickly dragged him forward. When the others saw this, they immediately chased after him. The drunkard pointed at their backs and shouted indignantly, "Who's a drunkard? I've never been drunk in my life." After saying that, he staggered away. After returning to the manor, Mrs. Ning saw that the manor was dark and barely anyone was walking around the courtyard. She quickly asked the butler to investigate what was going on. However, Yang Shiqing was not in the mood to deal with this. He returned to the house to wash up, ate a bite, and went back to sleep. After Mrs. Ning returned to her room, she saw her daughter eating obediently at the table. She walked over and said, "Ruer, you naughty girl. Why didn't you wait for Mom to come back for dinner?" "No, Mom. Nanny brought the food here, so I couldn't hold back." "Mistress, the food was sent by young Mississippi. She said she didn't know when you all would be back, so we should let the Ruer eat first." Mrs. Ning was surprised by that. She remembered how Yang Wanning had avenged Mrs. Gu today and wondered if she was trying to rope them in. After all, Yang Wanyu and Yang Qingsen were more favored by Yang Shiqing. After what happened today, they had to rope in more people to stand by their side if they still wanted to gain a foothold in the residence. Ruer was the only child in the residence other than the two pairs of siblings. Did the young miss say anything else? Chapter 561 Morning 1. No, she just asked the kitchen to send food for young Missy. The nanny shook her head. Oh. Mrs. Ning responded thoughtfully and asked the servants to prepare warm water and her dinner. After Zhou confirmed the young residents wouldn't cause more trouble, she brought Gu Qingrui to her inner space to get busy. The next day, after breakfast, Zhou said to Gu Qingrui before he left, "Rui, let's pause our plans for the manor. I think something will happen at the young residence today. Are you sure you want to support her?" Gu Qingrui paused and asked. "Yeah, judging by her reaction yesterday, it's commendable. The main point is that she listened to our advice and didn't drag us down. On the other hand, Yang Qinglin is still a little arrogant. He still has more to learn. He has a good personality, but he's been spoiled by Mrs. Chui Corporation a little too much. By the way, let me know in advance if there's any trouble. 111 Go over directly. Oh, bring my aunt's dowry list over too. If we need it, it could save us the trouble of making another trip." "All right." Zhou nodded. After he left, she changed into dark-colored clothes and asked Shizhu to buy some incense and food offerings. While waiting, she extended her divine senses to look at the young residents. Perhaps because they were tired from yesterday's commotion, everyone in the young residence had just started their day. Of course, the butler had already gathered the servants and led them, carrying shovels and firewood, to the cemetery to dig a burial pit. At the same time, he set up a simple mourning hall for those who came to mourn. After breakfast, Yang Shiqing gathered everyone together and distributed their linen clothes for mourning. He brought Yang Qinglin and Yang Qingsen to the front yard, sitting at the entrance of the mourning hall. Unfortunately, 2 hours had passed, and only the first prince and the Marquis of Dingan's servants had come. They each offered 100 taels of silver in condolences. No one else came. Zhou saw the time was almost right, so she brought Shizhu over. After entering, she wrote down her condolences in an etiquette book and offered 100 taels of silver. After burning 3 incense sticks as prayer, she said to Yang Shiqing, "Uncle, my condolences." Yang Shiqing nodded lightly and did not reply. Yang Qinglin stood up and said, "Cousin-in-law, why are you the only one here? Where's my brother Rui? He said he would come over after he's done with his work. He should be here soon." "Is that so? Okay, 111 bring you to my sister." After Yang Qinglin finished speaking, he wanted to bring her to the back. "It's better to let your mother Ning bring your cousin-in-law over. It isn't appropriate if someone comes later and you, the eldest grandson, aren't here." Yang Shiqing raised his head and said, "No worries, you wait here. I'll go to the back to look for your sister myself." Zhou gave him a look, then went out and followed Mrs. Ning to the old madam's small courtyard. Seeing the women waiting inside, Zhou greeted them one by one. When she saw Yang Wanyu wasn't there, she deliberately asked Yang Wanning, "Oh, where's Yang Wanyu? She's supposed to be the main character today, isn't she? She said she's tired and would come out when it's time to set off. Yang Wanning blinked and replied. She knew the real reason was that rumors and gossip about the Yang family had already spread throughout the capital this morning. Yang Wanyu, the daughter of Mrs. Chui, was the main target of everyone's gossip. Words such as hypocrisy, meanness, viciousness, and ruthlessness were all directed at her. Some even felt she was the continuation of Mrs. Cui's evil plans. She was in a worse spot than Zhou Ying when the Gu family was in trouble. Some gossip even concluded that the first prince would break off her engagement soon, so Yang Wanyu couldn't bear it anymore and shut herself in. If it really doesn't work, make a fuss about the dowry. If he were to prepare a dowry for Yang Wanyu, it would be impossible for him not to touch your mother's dowry. Yang Wanning's eyes lit up. Yes, my mother's dowry mustn't fall into the hands of the enemy's daughter. But with such a big problem related to the Chui family, will King Hui still marry Wanyu? You should know that your father is on King Hui's side, right? Yang Wanyu paused when she heard that. That's right. Based on the various signs in her previous life, her father should be one of the trusted aides of King Hui. Otherwise, he would not have been promoted so quickly. He definitely had something on King Hui. Even if it wasn't fatal, it was still something major. Therefore, as long as Yang Shiqing was still alive, Prince Hui would not give up on marrying Yang Wanyu unless it was absolutely necessary. Cousin-in-law, why do you think King Hui didn't do anything when my father went to prison? Maybe he doesn't dare to. I heard the emperor is in charge of the Chui family's affairs. Another reason is that he might still be useful. Chapter 563 Sever Relationship 1. After hearing that, Yang Wanning looked at her in surprise, and soon she laughed. That's right. The emperor was a person with many doubts. If someone did something under his nose, wouldn't that invite disaster? After that, the two women chatted for a while longer. They never imagined they wouldn't need to wait until Yang Wanyu's wedding, as a perfect opportunity presented itself for the siblings to sever their relationship with Yang Shiqing. Yang Shiqing could not fall asleep at night as he lay on his bed, tossing and turning. In his mind, the scene of Mother God appearing at the execution ground in broad daylight kept flashing. This reminded him that before Mrs. Chui died, she kept nagging about Mrs. Gu asking for her life. Since the gods have appeared, ghosts should also exist, right? The more he thought about it, the more annoyed he was. He could not help but believe 80% of Mrs. Cui's words. Therefore, the next day, he asked the butler to find a rather famous Taoist priest, Ling Fengzi. He brought the priest directly to Mrs. Gu's grave and dug it up. He used blood threads, Tao talismans, and 99 soul-suppressing nails to nail Mrs. Gu's coffin firmly. Gu Qingrui found out after receiving a note from the spy he had sent to the Yang residence. He quickly went straight to King Rui and had someone inform the Yang siblings and Zhou Ying. He then promptly rushed to Mrs. Gu's grave. On the way, when Zhou Ying went down to buy some offerings, she deliberately found a young beggar and promised to give him 100 pounds of black flour if he could spread the news. When the group of people arrived at Mrs. Gu's grave, the Taoist priest was almost done with his work. Moreover, Zhou Ying could tell that this Taoist priest was someone capable. The talisman he placed on the coffin really had a certain effect. Therefore, before she got off the carriage, he drew out Guard Chu's sword and rushed forward to chop the Taoist priest's hand. How dare you! After the Taoist priest dodged it, he tried to counterattack. Gu Qingrui came over and kicked him in the back. Stinky priest, are you courting death? He quickly pressed the Taoist priest to the ground. Yang Shiqing noticed the couple, and his face went pale. When he saw King Rui not far away, as well as Yang Wanning and her brother with a murderous expression, his legs went weak, and he nearly fell to the ground. When the butler saw this, he collapsed to the ground and trembled. Soon, young Wanning and her brother rushed over. They looked at Yang Shiqing with bloodshot eyes and shouted, "You are no longer our father." After that, Yang Wanning started kicking the butler. The butler turned around and wanted to run, but Guard Chu walked over and held him down. When Yang Wanning and her brother saw this, they punched and kicked him mercilessly. The one they wanted to hit the most was Yang Shiqing, but they could only vent their anger on the butler because of their status. However, when he saw their ruthlessness, Yang Shiqing knew what they were thinking. At this thought, a trace of viciousness flashed across his eyes. "Stop hitting me, stop it. This is master's intention. I'm just following orders." The butler could not take it anymore and immediately shouted. The Taoist priest, whom Gu Qingrui held down, immediately added, "I'm just doing as I'm paid. This matter has nothing to do with me. Accepting money for this. You're going against the heavens. Aren't you afraid of getting struck by lightning?" "I am doing this to survive." The Taoist priest smiled bitterly. "I'll give you one chance. Remove the things on top of the coffin and don't damage the bones one bit." Chapter 564 Sever Relationship 2. No. It's impossible unless we change a coffin. The Taoist priest shook his head. When Zhou Ying saw this, she immediately took out a banknote worth 500 taels of silver and handed it to Guard Chu. "Sorry to trouble you, but can you help us make a trip and buy the best coffin you can?" "Mrs. Gu, you're too polite," Guard Chu said as he received the silver notes. Buy more joss paper." The Taoist priest raised his head and reminded him. Guard Chu shot him a cold glance and immediately turned around to leave. Yang Wanning and her brother were also tired. They stopped hitting the butler. They looked at Yang Shiqing with hatred. A moment later, Yang Wanning said, "Since my mother has no place in your heart, we won't force you any longer. Today, we siblings represent our mother's decision to separate from you. From now on, our surnames will be changed to Gu, and we will no longer be an eyesore to you." "Impossible. It was your mother who caused trouble." Without waiting for Yang Shiqing to finish, Yang Wanning laughed and said, "It seems Mrs. Chui has a high position in your heart. More than 10 years of being married, and the Gu family supported you all this time." 66 sets of dowry had supported the Yang family for more than a decade, but it was nothing compared to the rumors spat by Mrs. Chui. "You are really a good example of a husband." "I agree with this. Although the Gu family has declined, it's not to the extent that they can't afford to raise 2 children. From today onwards, my aunt and you are no longer husband and wife." Gu Qingrui echoed. "Yang Qinglin, what about you? Are you going to mess around with them too?" Yang Shiqing immediately looked at Yang Qinglin. He would never allow this divorce. Otherwise, the Yang family would collapse once the Gu family's dowry was taken away. "Who is messing around? You don't even respect my mother's corpse. Do you even treat me as your son? I'm innocent and easily deceived, but I'm not stupid." Yang Qinglin clenched his fists and questioned loudly. After shouting that, his tears fell. What happened during this period made him realize that his father had no intention of caring for them. He only cared about his benefits and his future. But Yang Qinglin never expected his father would not even let a dead person off for profit. If they had a conflict of interest in the future, his father would definitely abandon him. This matter is non-negotiable. Do you want to deal with it yourself, or do you want to bring it to the authorities? Gu Qingrui said. When Yang Shiqing turned to look at him again, his eyes were filled with killing intent. However, Gu Qingrui did not retreat. Instead, he looked at him coldly. About 15 minutes later, young Shurching saw that he had no room for compromise. He snorted coldly and said, "I'll satisfy your request. However, this cemetery belongs to our Yang family. Since Mrs. Gu is no longer our Yang family's daughter-in-law, please move her away as soon as possible. I have the same intention. I don't think my aunt wants to be buried with her enemy." Gu Qingrui looked at the Taoist priest and said, "Help us find a good place with good feng shui, and we'll forgive you. How about it?" "Okay." The Taoist priest nodded repeatedly. "If you dare do a shoddy job, we will ask Mother God to teach you a lesson." Shouing added. When the Taoist priest heard the word Mother God, he immediately remembered the lightning on the execution ground. He couldn't help but shiver and nod repeatedly. "Definitely, definitely. I'll give you a piece of advice. Don't do any more evil in this life. Otherwise, you might be whipped for the rest of your life." "Understood," the Taoist priest said, twitching his lips. After saying that, he immediately turned around and took a mat. He covered the coffin and pulled out the nails. After removing the nails, he went aside to look for the cemetery under Gu Shengrui's supervision. Chapter 565 Sever Relationship 3. When Guard Chu returned, Gu Qingrui and Zhou had already settled the cemetery matter after buying a plot of land from the local village chief. After that, the Taoist priest helped move Mrs. Gu's grave. After arriving at the grave, Zhou spread out her divine sense and scanned the cemetery surroundings. Although she knew little about feng shui, she could see this was a good spot for Mrs. Gu's grave. At the very least, it didn't make her uncomfortable. After the burial, young Wanning and young Qinglin burned a large amount of joss paper and cried bitterly. After they were done, the group of people quickly returned to the capital. King Rui and the others went to the Yang residence, while Zhou took the opportunity to return home. After taking the list of dowries and some snacks, she asked Hai Tang to prepare a table of vegetarian food before returning to the Yang residence. When she arrived in the living room, she saw that everyone was there, so she placed the snacks on the table. She placed King Rui's favorite hawthorn snack before him and said, "Everyone, have this as a snack for now. We'll have a meal at our house later." Gu Qingrui got up and handed the dowry list to Yang Shurching. "I'm sure over the years, other than the land and shops, there is nothing else left. We will not be calculative. You just need to return the land and shops." Yang Shurching heaved a sigh of relief, as he had bought a few properties during the disaster. Although the income wasn't much, he could at least maintain the expenses of the residence. He looked at the siblings and asked, "Are you really going to change your surname to Gu?" "Yes, you still have 3 children anyway, but my mother only has us." When young Wanning said this, her eyes flashed, and she added provocatively, "Of course, if no one cares for you when you're old, we'll help you take care of your old age." In her previous life, young Wanyu left her with no one to rely on in her previous life. In the end, she even killed her with her own hands. Young Wanyu could forget about living a good life in this lifetime. Young Wanning wanted young Wanyu to lose everything, bit by bit, and taste the despair of her previous life. Of course, she still acted professionally, making people think she was sincere in her offer. She had her own motives for saying this. She did not want King Rui to think that the siblings were ungrateful children. Young Qinglin nodded as well. Young Shurching was so angry that he wanted to beat her up, but he had to admit that what she said made sense. Based on Yang Wanyu and Yang Chengsen's attitude toward him these 2 days, he knew he would not have a good life if he were cared for by them in his old age. It seemed he had to hurry up and have another 1 or 2 sons. Because Gu Shengrui's demands weren't too much, he quickly gave in. He took out all the title deeds from the shops belonging to the Gu family and happily wrote down a separation letter. Just as he was done, young Wanyu rushed in and yelled, "Father, you can't return the dowry to them. There are 2 manors and shops that are already mine. Don't mess around." Young Shiqing glared at her. At the same time, young Wanning sneered. "Don't tell me you want to use my mother's dowry as your dowry. Where's your face?" Hearing her words, young Wanyu suddenly remembered the rumors from before. She went forward and tried clawing at her face. Seeing this, young Wanning did not stand still. She took a step to the right and grabbed her left wrist. She stepped forward and turned her toes to pin young Wanyu's leg. She pressed down hard on the crook of her leg. At the same time, she placed the back of her hand behind young Wanyu and pressed her down forcefully. It took a while to describe, but it happened in an instant. Before young Wanyu could react, she felt pain in her arms and legs. She knelt on the ground with a shocked expression. Young Shiqing was shocked and quickly asked young Wanning, "When did you learn martial arts?" Chapter 566 Sever Relationship 4. I didn't go out of my way to learn it. I only followed my cousin-in-law to learn 2 moves for self-defense. Young Wanning looked at young Wanyu and added, "I won't be making things difficult for you because we're related. But that doesn't mean one will ignore that you've harmed me every step of the way. That little bit of blood relationship can only go so far. In the future, we will no longer be related. If you dare harm me again, one won't be polite anymore." Young Wanyu immediately looked at young Shiqing. However, young Shiqing was not happy about her either. If it weren't for her scheming about her dowry, the young family wouldn't have reached this point. Wanning is right. You should restrain your temper. Otherwise, you'll only cause more trouble in the future. Young Wanyu looked at her father in disbelief. She did not dare to make a fuss. Instead, she looked at young Wanning unwillingly and spat, "Let me go." Young Wanning did not make things difficult for her after hearing that. She simply stood up and retreated to the side. Without making a fuss, young Shiqing got up and brought Gu Qingrui and young Wanning to the government office to settle the rest of the procedures. Meanwhile, Zhou asked Chuanxi, Mrs. Sun, and young Chenglin's errand boy, Xiao Shu, to pack up the siblings' belongings. It was mainly their clothes, bedding, and personal belongings. They then pulled 2 big carts filled with stuff and returned to the Gu residence with King Rui. Everyone ate lunch once they returned to the Gu residence. After lunch, King Rui and Gu Qingrui went to work. Zhou arranged for the 2 siblings to stay in the side courtyard. Young Wanning, no, Gu Wanning, quickly shook her head and said, "Cousin-in-law, we can just stay in the wing room and save some firewood. There is a lot of firewood here, so don't worry. Moreover, it is convenient for you to have your own courtyard if you have a friend coming over." Zhou shook her head and replied. Besides, she was not used to them hanging around. It would be better if they could leave her some personal space. "Sorry to trouble you, cousin-in-law." Gu Wanning did not insist, and she thanked her. Afterward, the siblings brought their luggage and servants to the side courtyard. Zhou sent a helper to help the siblings clean up and do rough work. After an entire afternoon, word spread that young Shiqing had hired a Taoist priest to bind Mrs. Gus's soul and that Gu Wanning and her brother had left the Yang family. Of course, most of everyone, especially the women, agreed with Gu Wanning and her brother's actions. They felt that young Shiqing had gone too far. Unfortunately, there were also some selfish people who felt that young Shiqing was right and that Gu Wanning and her brother were too stubborn. Ultimately, it was a mostly positive reaction regarding Gu Wanning and her brother. On the other hand, young Shiqing was furious when he heard the news. He did not expect that his secretive actions would spread. He didn't need to guess to know it had something to do with the Gu family. He now despised the couple. Regardless, he did not care about them for the time being. He quickly went straight to Mrs. Ning to discuss the matter of Yang Wanya's dowry. He bought whatever was cheap and practical. He avoided anything expensive at all costs. As a result, despite the fact that they had prepared 40 sets of dowry, it cost less than 10,000 taels of silver. This included a small manor on approximately 200 acres of land and a small shop of roughly 20 square meters on the city's eastern outskirts. In the evening, Sun Miaoke finished her meal alone and went to check the accounts of her residence for the past few years. At this moment, Qing Tao came over with a cup of tea and said, "Consort, I heard that His Highness helped Yang Wanning break away from the Yang family today and move to the Gu residence." Chapter 567 Some thoughts. She has finally freed herself from a sea of suffering. Otherwise, she might not get anything in the end. Sun Miaoke stopped writing and spoke. "Aren't you jealous? She hasn't even married yet, and His Highness is already helping her so much." Qing Tao said indignantly. "Did someone say something to you?" Sun Miaoke asked. "No, I just feel wronged for you." Qing Tao shook her head. "Is His Highness mistreating me?" "No, but, Qing Tao, from the moment I decided to marry into this family, I knew I couldn't monopolize His Highness. To be honest, I'm already grateful for us being able to treat each other respectfully. As for Yang Wanning, honestly, she doesn't have much weight in His Highness' heart. The ones he really holds dear are the Gu couple. So in the future, over the years, you have heard of many fights between wives and consorts, but in the end, none of them live comfortably, no matter who wins or loses. For example, Mrs. Chui had successfully caused the death of Mrs. Gu, but what did she get in the end? Did Lord Yang save her with all his heart? It's obvious that even she wasn't that important in Lord Yang's heart. You saw my aunt clearly all these years. She is my uncle's wife and can bully the concubines at will. My uncle also respects her very much. However, my uncle will still marry a new girl every 2 or 3 years. Do you think she really is happy? No, she's bitter on the inside. It's just that her heart had been in pain too many times and had become numb. She had no choice but to only close one eye to this." Sun Liaoke was in a daze as she said this. She continued, "But look at my father. For many years, my grandmother has brought up taking in concubines, and the officialdom even sent him many beauties. But he didn't want any of them. What does this mean? Whether a man is a playboy or not, it all depends on his intentions. As a woman, the most important thing we can do is try our best to give him a warm home and present her best side to him. At the same time, we must protect ourselves. The rest depends on the man. The key was not to give away your true feelings first. Otherwise, your feelings might be mangled once you want to take them back." Of course, she did not dare to say this out loud. Otherwise, if word got out, she could forget about taking another step forward with His Highness in the future. Seeing that Sun Miaoke had thought it through clearly, Qing Tao did not say anything else and obediently retreated. As for Sun Miaoke, she wasn't in the mood to write anymore. Because she did not know if she could keep her heart from wavering before the outstanding King Rui in the future. Would she become as ruthless and unscrupulous as the Empress or Mrs. Chui? On the other end, Zhou waited for most of the residents to fall asleep before quietly leaving the house with Gu Qingrui. They went to a small courtyard north of the city and found the little beggar who had helped her spread Yang Shiqing's scandal during the day. She handed him the 100 pounds of black flour and said, "Guzi, hide these well. It should be enough for you to eat for a winter." Guzi looked at the big bag of black flour and asked with a troubled expression, "Sister, can you help me keep it and give us 10 pounds a month?" Reason: Uncle Chi, who protected us before, has left. A group of children like us can't guard this. How old is the oldest of you? Me. I'm 12 this year. At this moment, a young beggar walked over and replied. His eyes were fierce, like a wolf cub, and his footsteps were light. It was obvious that he had practiced some sort of martial art. You know martial arts? Gu Shengruo's eyes lit up. Chapter 568. Good Seedling. Zhouing frowned because his body had a bloody aura when she saw him. There was an 80% chance he had taken someone's life previously. I know how to fight. Previously, Uncle Chi was afraid we would be bullied, so he taught us a set of fish techniques. The young man looked at Gu Qingrui and replied. In other words, all of you know martial arts. Yes, but some are good at it while others are average. What did the uncle you mentioned do before? Will he come back? What do you want? The young man looked at him warily and asked. Nothing special. We want to recruit some guards for our place, but I don't know what your standards are. Guards. Yes, guards. My uncle used to be an escort mercenary. After the disaster, he was trapped in the capital. Seeing that we were pitiful, he stayed behind to protect us. Some time ago, he said that he had received a new escort mission, so he returned to his hometown with some people. Gu Qingrui nodded thoughtfully and replied, I see. Do consider whether you want to continue being beggars or follow us. The young boy nodded and took out a bag. After putting in a small amount of black flour, he said, Sorry to trouble you, but I'll give you a reply at this time, 3 days later. Okay, but let me make it clear first. I only want someone with solid martial arts capabilities. After Gu Qingrui finished speaking, he picked up the bag of flour and left with Zhouing. After they were far away, Zhouing put away the bag and asked, Didn't you say that the situation in the capital is complicated? Aren't you afraid of being cheated? We can't give up eating because of fear of choking, right? That kid is a good seedling for practicing martial arts, so I want to try to recruit him. Alright, you know what you're doing. However, I have to remind you that there's blood on his hands. Are you sure? I'm sure. It seems that we really have to investigate properly. Gu Qingrui nodded seriously. The next morning, Mingyu came over. Seeing that Gu Wanning was fine, she hurriedly went to train her female soldiers. Meanwhile, young Qinglin went back to the academy. Zhouing returned the 50,000 taels of silver to Gu Wanning and said, Since you've moved out of the wolf's lair, you can hold on to the money for yourself. Thank you, cousin-in-law. It just so happens that I want to buy a house for Qinglin. You've thought it through, but I think you should wait a little longer. Otherwise, if Yang Shiqing finds out that you have a lot of money in your hands, he might slander your reputation. Moreover, Qinglin is still young and will be living in the academy most of the time. It's better to let him live here if he needs to for a few more years. When he's older, only then do we get him ready for adulthood. Gu Wanning paused when she heard that. She nodded and replied, You're right. Okay, I'll buy it only after I get married. Yes, the most important thing now is to prepare the dowry. Later, you can discuss with Mrs. Sun and draft a list. Your cousin and I will help you on this. Thank you, cousin-in-law. If it wasn't for you two helping me, I'm afraid I would have been in a terrible position. We can help you for now, but we can't help you forever. So, you must learn from this and mature as soon as possible. After all, there are many things that we can't interfere with after you enter King Rui's residence. We might not be able to help you after that. Gu Wanning nodded in agreement. I will. There's still a long way to go in the future. I'm sure I'll be independent as soon as possible. The two of them chatted for a while more. Zhouing asked her to keep the silver notes, and the two went back to practice some more martial arts. After 2 days, once Gu Qingrui was done with the matters here, the three brought Lin Yiqian to their manor. Chapter 569. Heading to the manor, the young beggar, Chi Fong, and 5 others were taken into the manor. However, after Lin Etienne and the rest did their investigations and tests, they only accepted Chi Fong and another person with good innate ability as guards. Biaozi took in 2 beggars as kitchen helpers. The remaining 2 were handed over to Zhou Dashing to run errands and do odd jobs. When they arrived at the manor, Gu Qingrui went straight to the fields while Zhou Ying and Gu Wanning carried their luggage to a small courtyard. When they were almost settled, Widow Wu walked over and asked, "Madam, what do you want to eat for lunch? What's available?" Zhou Ying thought for a moment and asked. "There are still 3 eggs left, along with some carrots and cabbages." "Is Lord Chen also in the manor?" "Yes, he has been staying with 2 bailiffs at the shed to keep an eye on the vegetables." "They live in the shed?" "Yes, they're also eating their meals over there. Head Fong has persuaded them to come over more than once. However, they did not agree. They said that it was convenient to stay there and watch the shed. Moreover, it's warmer there." "All right. Take out all the ingredients, and I'll cook lunch while you help me." "Understood, I will go down and prepare the kitchen." Widow Wu turned around and walked away. "You want to invite Lord Qin and the other 2 for lunch?" Gu Wanning asked. "Yeah, they've been keeping an eye on the vegetable for us. Since we're here, we must show some respect in return." "I see. Let's cook together later. I can also learn a few moves from you." "No problem. Although you have servants to serve you, it's best if you learn 2 specialty dishes. When the time comes, you can cook for His Highness from time to time." Gu Wanning nodded shyly, and she deeply agreed with her words. After all, young Wan Yu had snatched her husband away with a bowl of pear soup in her previous life. She had to learn more cooking from now on. "Let's go take a walk and stretch our muscles." Zhou Ying smiled and let her out when she saw she had listened to her advice. First, she went to the shed and saw that the sweet potato seedlings had already begun to be planted. She took off her coat to help out Gu Qingrui. About an hour later, Zhou Ying stood up and said to Gu Qingrui, "Rui, bring the 3 brothers to our house for lunch when it's noon." "Madam, there's no need." Halfway through Qin He's words, Gu Qingrui raised his hand to stop him. "Just give us this one. Let's have a good chat at noon about the problems you've encountered recently." "It's settled then. I'll return and cook now." After Zhou Ying finished speaking, she left the shed. After coming out, she walked around the shed at the side. When she saw some small rape seeds that were ready to be eaten, she picked a bunch and filled half a basket. After returning to the courtyard, Zhou Ying handed it to Gu Wanning and said, "Take it to the kitchen and wash it. I'll go get something else." After saying that, Zhou Ying returned to her room. After putting down her cloak, she went to her inner space to get a piece of cured meat, about 2 pounds of dried mushrooms, and a bag of black fungus mushrooms. When she returned to the kitchen, she saw the 2 women washing the vegetables. Zhou Ying took a little of the 3 ingredients she brought and soaked them. She then checked the ingredients that Widow Wu had prepared. They were radishes, cabbages, some dried vegetables, and a bowl of black noodles. Zhou Ying pondered for a moment and decided to use some bacon and dried hemp vegetables as well. Zhou Ying started stir-frying the mushrooms, pickling the cabbages in vinegar, and stir-frying the eggs with black fungus mushrooms. She originally wanted to mix them with shredded radishes but had to change plans when there wasn't white sugar here. She stewed the radishes instead. Chapter 570 depends on his capabilities. After knowing what to cook, the 3 of them got busy. Around noon, the scrumptious dishes were served. Especially the dish filled with bacon and hemp vegetables. It was salty, fragrant, and very tempting just after smelling it. Gu Wanning couldn't help but eat one as soon as it was out of the pot. However, Widow was heart-ached as she looked at the oil can. Het Fong had found this piece of suet with great difficulty. She hadn't expected. After Zhou saw her expression, she just smiled and did not take it to heart. When treating a guest to a meal, she had to let the guest eat comfortably. Otherwise, she might as well not treat them. As for the oil, she could just go out and buy a pig in the afternoon or even take some out of her interspace. Sure enough, Chen He and the other two ate well and were extremely satisfied. Zhou couldn't even eat her fill. In the end, she could only take 2 buns from her interspace to eat. After the meal, they rested briefly before Widow Wu and Gu Wanning went to the shed to help. On the other hand, Zhou took Het Fong and went out to collect the pigs with an ox cart. After driving for an entire afternoon, they finally bought a pig that weighed more than 100 pounds in one of the villages. On the way back, Zhou asked, "Uncle Fong, do you have a successor in this manner?" "Mrs. Zhou, what do you mean by that?" Het Fong was stunned for a moment before he turned his head and asked nervously. "Have you heard that we bought another manor?" "I heard, but that place, I heard it's a place that can't grow anything. As long as it can grow grass, it will be fine. Our idea is that that place will mainly engage in livestock farming and plant some fruits and vegetables for the restaurant to use in the future. I noticed that you're familiar with the surrounding manors, so I want you to go over and give it a try at managing our manor. As for this manor, it's already stable. As long as someone is keeping an eye on it, it will be fine as long as nothing goes wrong. Of course, I won't force you if you're unwilling." Het Fong went silent for a moment after hearing this. Ultimately, he nodded and replied, "I'll listen to Madam's arrangements. As long as you think I can take over the new manor, I'll go over." To be honest, anyone literate and stern enough could manage the current manor other than growing vegetables and farming crops. However, it was different in the new manor. From Zhou Ying's words, the stuff they were planning for the new manor would be their restaurant's main source of income. Even selling the livestock elsewhere would earn them a lot of money, which would also increase his value. "Alright, we can only start after spring. If there's no suitable person to take over your position, quickly train one. After spring, we will need to go over there and build some houses, cattle pens, sheep pens, and so on." "I understand. My eldest son has been managing the manor with me. Do you think he can do it?" "Whether he can do it or not, it depends on his capabilities. Let him manage it for some time and give him more practice." "All right. I'll start making arrangements when I get back." Later, Zhou asked him about the situation in the nearby manors. She was a little surprised when she learned that all the surrounding manors belonged to officials. What surprised her was that a manor under Yang Chenglin's name specialized in farming. However, the head of the manor had been a little dishonest in the past 2 days and had been selling their stuff. After returning home, Zhou ordered her help to slaughter the pigs as soon as possible. She then personally treated everyone in the manor to a meal of pork and vegetables. She later asked Het Fong to sell a portion of the meat to the people in the manor at a fair price. In the end, only 2 plates of pork ribs and a piece of suet were left. She handed them over to Widow Wu. After everyone left, Zhou told Gu Wanning about the situation of the manor under Yang Chenglin's name and said, "In my opinion, you should hurry up and deal with it. At least, you should get rid of Mrs. Cui's men. Otherwise, it would be difficult to take it back from them after they ruin it." Chapter 571 Childbirth. I can't believe their guts. Gu Wanning huffed angrily. It's not too late to take action. Moreover, since they started this, you can take the opportunity to establish your hold over them. Gu Qingqing reminded her. That's true. I'll go over tomorrow. Okay, I'll ask Lin Etienne to accompany you. If the people there are unusable, you'd better sell them off quickly. I understand. Gu Wanning nodded in agreement. The next morning, Lin Etienne accompanied Gu Wanning and set off. However, they did not go directly to the manor. Instead, they went home to get the manor's head and his family's contracts. Lin Etienne brought the other 3 guards along as well. With their company, Gu Wanning had no more worries. When they arrived at the manor, they reminded them who was in charge. When they realized that the head of the manor was unrelenting, they immediately checked the accounts and took back the money he had earned from selling livestock without permission. They then sold these people to the south of the country. She then appointed the manor's head that Mrs. Gu had chosen previously. Over the next few days, Gu Wanning brought her people to the other 3 manors and checked the accounts. If there were any problems, she would replace the people there. Meanwhile, Shouing was helping to take care of the shed in the manor. With her joining in, Gu Qingrui wasn't as stressed and had more time to continue learning his medical skills. 5 days later, King Kang's consort, Zhou Jiaying, gave birth to a baby girl in the early morning. It was only at night that she slowly woke up. Seeing that only Nanny Yu was in the room, she struggled to poke her head out and shouted, "Mrs. Yu. Mistress, you woke up. How do you feel now?" Mrs. Yu quickly walked over and asked. "I'm fine. I'm just hungry and want to eat something." "Okay, please wait for a moment. I'll warm up the porridge for you." After speaking, Mrs. Yu left and brought over a small bowl of red date millet porridge. "Mistress, hurry up and give it a sip." This had been cooking for the entire afternoon. Zhou Jiaying pushed it away and said, "It's too hot, so let's wait for a while." "Has His Highness been here?" "He did, and he brought some tonics over." After looking at Mistress, he left when he noticed you were asleep. "He even told us to take good care of you, and if you need anything, just let him know." "Did he say anything about asking for a seal?" "No, he probably wanted to wait until you woke up." Mrs. Yu shook her head. "Oh." Zhou Jiaying also felt that what she said made sense, so she lay down and rested for a while before eating the porridge. After breakfast, her family came instead of King Kong the next morning. After sitting for a while, Mother Zhou told her a few things to take note of and went to see the baby. Zhou Jiaqing sat down and asked, "Sis, how do you feel?" "Fortunately, the birth went smoothly, and I didn't suffer much." Zhou Jiaying carefully looked at her face and said, "Good. There's no mark on your face. Of course, our father is the principle of medicine. Don't be happy too early. You have to be more careful in the future. By the way, I heard Mother is talking about your marriage. Is there anyone you like?" Zhou Jiaqing shook her head dejectedly. She was in a difficult situation. The good ones didn't fancy her, and the others were too lousy to be her husband. She was placed between a rock and a hard place. Thinking of this, she huffed indignantly, "It's all Zhou Ying's fault. If she hadn't caused me to lose face at the banquet, I would have become King Rui's consort long ago. I wouldn't have to be left at home to be picked and chosen." Zhou Jiaying was speechless. Although she wasn't there then, she knew of the incident afterward. To put it bluntly, Zhou Jiaqing was acting brainlessly. Her schemes failed, and she even got herself into trouble, ruining her reputation. You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.